Hello! Welcome to another slightly shorter, spooky, festive episode of Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin, and I'm joined by a slightly shorter, spooky, festive man, Michael Whitehouse. How the heck are you, Mike?
I'm good. I am good. I can see the Christmas lights over there, and we're still all festive, and that's great.
Good. Are you ready to journey into one of the weirdest mysteries of Christmas past?
I'm always ready.
Splendid. So, the events we're discussing in tonight's episode took place 4 decades ago, almost to the day. In fact, if you happen to be listening on the day of release, then what you're about to hear took place exactly 40 years ago tonight, December 29th, 1980. We're in that weird, hazy time between Christmas and New Year. At approximately 8:30 p.m. that night, an Oldsmobile Cutlass set out from the township of New Caney in Texas, not far outside Houston, and headed east along the FM 1485, a small 2-lane farm-to-market road passing through a rural, wooded landscape. A road that at times skirts the edge of the Lake Houston Wilderness Park. In the car are 3 people: 57-year-old Vickie Landrum, her 7-year-old grandson Colby Landrum, and Vickie's friend, 51-year-old Betty Cash. I don't believe she was named after a work expenses form, Mike. The trio are headed home to the town of Dayton, about a 50-minute drive from New Caney, where they'd stopped for dinner. The 3 had originally set out for a bingo game in Cleveland, but when they got there, they had found that the venue was closed for the holiday, so they'd gone for dinner in New Caney instead, and they'd finished up there about 8:30 p.m. As the road reaches the end of the Wilderness Park and passes near a small settlement known as Lazy Creek, the road bends south and the name of the route changes to Huffman Cleveland Road. It was around this point where, briefly, the passengers had a less obstructed view of the sky that they first noticed a strange bright light hovering distantly over the line of the trees. At the time, the eyewitnesses wrote it off as a plane coming into land at Houston Intercontinental, about 30 miles from their location at that time. They continued on their way. So now they're heading south on Huffman Cleveland Road, and this has taken them in the direction in which they saw the light, and they continued to glimpse this light on and off through the trees. This is a very long, straight section of road, but the whole area, again, this is pretty dense woodland, so wooded that the trees practically meet overhead in places, forming that sort of eerie tunnel effect, when you're driving through thick trees. And obviously this is Texas, so the trees never fully lose their foliage. They thin out a bit, but they never quite lose all their leaves. Not at this time of year anyway. Had this been summer though, they might not have been able to see much of anything, at least not yet. But through the sparser winter boughs, they can't initially make out too many details, but there it is again. There's this strange light winking, twinkling, and seemingly getting closer. Until finally, at approximately 9 p.m, half an hour after they set out, suddenly the object is above them, almost directly ahead and above them, hanging there just above treetop height, about 60 to 80 feet, 18 to 25 metres above the surface of the road.
Every person for themselves at that point, throwing people in front of you.
The object, as the eyewitnesses described it, was shaped like a diamond that's been cut off flat at the top and the bottom. Cash described its size in quite an interesting way. She described it as being roughly that of the Dayton Water Tower. If you spend any time watching American true crime documentaries, you're familiar with the size of the average small-town water tower. They love their shots of water towers in these shows for some reason. I don't have a precise figure for the Dayton, Texas water tower, but in an interview on podcast UFO in 2013, Colby Landrum estimates that it was probably 50 feet in width and maybe up to 100 feet in height. The object itself appeared to be of a dull, metallic colour, with a ridge around its middle wreathed with small blue lights. From its base, flames appeared to be shooting down towards the road in a sort of intermittent pulsing motion. The object produced a loud whooshing sound that Betty would later describe as being similar to air brakes. And Vickie, Betty, and Colby all described a powerful heat radiating from the object through the windscreen of the car. The occupants of the car were stunned, and I think it's fair to say frightened by this phenomenon. Betty, who was driving, initially tried to pass the object, well, by putting her foot down and passing straight under it, but the heat from the thing was so intense that Vickie intervened, yelled at Betty to stop, slamming her hand down on the dash. The heat from the object was such that, supposedly, this action left a visible handprint on the softened vinyl of the dashboard that was still visible weeks later. So, Betty stops just before reaching the object. Young Colby Landrum, meanwhile, is terrified. This is only a 7-year-old boy, remember. God, can you imagine?
Yeah.
He's asking his grandmother, what's happening? Are they about to come face to face with
Santa? It's Santa!
Yeah. I suspect Colby's point of reference here is stuff like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
This is 1980. But Vickie's interpretation of what she's looking at least in these first few minutes, at least for a moment, is rather different. She believes at that moment that she's witnessing the second coming of Jesus Christ.
As you do.
She says to Colby, "That's Jesus. Jesus won't hurt us." Now, Vickie Landrum was a born-again Christian, so the second coming obviously is something that looms very large in her worldview. It's probably less of a leap for her than it would be for a lot of people, but assuming she was a fairly sound mind, it does maybe serve to illustrate just how far beyond their normal everyday reality this phenomenon was. But I do enjoy the idea of Disco Jesus coming to Earth in a silver Christmas ornament. It's pretty ace, like Ziggy Stardust or something.
Yeah. It's David Bowie. It's David Bowie.
Betty, the driver, is looking for a means to get away. She can't go under the object, it's much too hot. She's worried the car is going to burst into flames. And she's not sure she's going to be able to do a U-turn because the road is very narrow, and so she claims, although I'll come to this in a minute, it's been raining, so the soft shoulder is a mud bath. The last thing she wants to do is get stuck in the mud under this thing. So she and Vickie do a pretty brave thing. They exit the car, ostensibly to get the lie of the land, to see if they can turn, see if they can get under it. And I think Betty, anyway, was curious. She wanted to get a better look at the thing. She takes a few steps towards it. The heat is furious. Colby is absolutely terrified, so Vickie gets back inside to comfort him. But Betty walks closer to the object, and she notices that as the rhythmic pulse of flames from the bottom of the object rises and falls in intensity, the object itself, at least as she described it, rose and fell slightly in the sky, like it was a thruster holding it up, maybe even struggling to hold it in position.
I was like, this thing's going to fall on them.
That's what it sounds like. Yeah.
Jesus won't hurt us. Just sit on us.
Yeah. Betty returned to the car. She reached for the handle to get back inside and burned her hand on the hot metal of the car door. She actually had to wrap her jacket around her hand like an oven glove just to get the door open. At this point, Vickie, Betty and Colby start to hear a loud, but rather more familiar, mechanical rumble in the sky above the whooshing of the object's own sounds. They see more lights converging on the thing, but these look and move and sound a lot more like conventional, dare I say, earthly aircraft. The object begins to move, clearing the road. The apparent thruster at the base flares and it moves off over the trees as though it was being escorted by these other aircraft. Up to this point, they haven't been able to make out what kind of aircraft these are. Are they planes? Are they helicopters? Just that from the noise and vibration, there's at least the sense that these are conventional terrestrial aircraft moving in tight formation. So now the road ahead is clear, the incredible heat lifts, and Betty's able to get the car moving and continue south on Huffman Cleveland Road. They're driving along, relieved but utterly stunned. Their close encounter lasted approximately 15 minutes. The object and its escort of aircraft peel off to the southwest, sort of at a diagonal to the road. So the lights are still visible through the trees, but they still can't quite make out the details on these other aircraft. At this stage, they're maybe only about halfway home. They reach a section with a few twists and turns. The aircraft and the UFO are in and out of visibility, but they seem to have changed course slightly and are now broadly following the overall direction of the road, albeit maybe a mile or so to the east of the car and its occupants now. Betty drives about 3.5 miles from the point of initial contact. She crosses a bridge over the loose bayou, makes another couple of twists and turns on the road, then pulls over onto the dirt shoulder outside a graveyard called Huffman Cemetery, because this story wasn't spooky enough, obviously.
It just sounds like the start of Night of the Creeps or something like that. It just feels like the start of some sort of science fiction film that melds with horror and involves a graveyard. Before you know it, Elvis is walking about.
Yeah. So the reason she stops at the cemetery is because here the trees have been cleared to make way for the graves, and it gives them the first chance to get a look again at the UFO and its escort as the objects continue to follow the road at about a mile or so's distance. They're just watching this and coming to terms with what they've experienced, just starting to calm themselves down, when suddenly a huge machine roars overhead, seemingly out of nowhere. It's a helicopter, Michael. And from this vantage point, they can now see that all of the things escorting the UFO are helicopters.
Right.
Betty, Vickie and Colby counted 23 helicopters flying in formation around this device vehicle. And these were not just any old helicopters. These appear to have been military aircraft. The witnesses will later identify a couple of them as Boeing CH-47 Chinooks. You know, the big tandem rotor heavy lifter things?
Yeah.
And these Chinooks have supposedly United States Air Force printed on the fuselage. Eventually, the bizarre fleet of aircraft moves southeast across Lake Houston and out of sight for the final time. Now, of course, if it was only these three who saw any of this, that would be very suspect. This route is mostly rural, very rural in some parts, but this is over a wide area. And at certain points, it's over small towns, villages, truck stops. When it flies off to the west, it's actually heading in the general direction of the city of Houston. Well, as it happens, there were other witnesses, at least for some parts of the event. Near the bend where FM 1485 curves over onto Huffman Cleveland Road, in the area known as Huffman, at the start of the very long straight stretch where miles further down, Betty Cash's car would meet the UFO. A man by the name of John Plaster was playing around with his son and his son's new Christmas toys.
There's always someone with a cracking name in these.
So this is very likely about the same time as the encounter, although he made the recollection about 2 years later, so we can't be 100% certain. But he claims that as they were playing, 4 or 5 Chinook helicopters roared overhead, causing him to remark to his son, "The army has something going on tonight." Some motorists also travelling on FM 1485, presumably a little over 15 minutes behind Betty's car, also noticed the bright light in the sky. They remarked that it appeared to be flying about 150 feet off the ground when they saw it, and that it was extremely large, bright, and moved very slowly through the sky.
How much later did they come forward?
I think most of this information was gathered by researchers in the sort of 2 or 3 years after the event.
Right.
Some of it was people who came forward to newspapers at the time as well. Rosalie and Michelle Seymour, a mother and daughter living in the village of Crosby, a couple of miles south of the contact site, reported seeing a bright glow in the sky to the north, and again a large number of helicopters active that night. Rosalie also noted that a lot of her neighbours, I don't know if this particular section of the route is a wealthy area or what, but it appears that homes in this area are very spread out on large tracts of land, and most of her neighbours were away for the holidays, so the area was more sparsely populated than usual, which might explain why there wasn't a flood of witnesses. Having said that, as I hope I'm illustrating here, there were nevertheless a lot more witnesses than usual for an event of this type. Lamar, or L.L. Walker, and his wife Marie, near Huffman, police officer and his wife, also that very same night reported a bright unknown object and a large group of apparently military helicopters flying around the Huffman Eastgate Road area that night. The couple were described as particularly reliable witnesses when they were interviewed by the army much later on. These are just a few of the people that came forward. We don't have the time tonight to go into all of their stories, and I should say that there were even some alleged witnesses of the UFO itself later that night over the city of Houston itself. bearing in mind that it was last seen going in that direction.
Really, really trying hard not to say, Houston, we have a problem. If anyone's from Houston, and they probably hear that all the time.
Sick of that shit, man.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, there's a Houston in Scotland, but it's Houston.
Aye.
But that's why I have to fight the urge to call Houston Houston. Very easy to do.
Houston, we have a problem. Tam's sheep have escaped again. They're on the main road.
So Jan Moffat, a native of Houston, I nearly said, a native of Houston, was travelling north on Interstate 45 in the north of the city after all this, and saw a huge, bright, distant object in the northern sky, which then disappeared out of sight behind the trees. So anyway, the occupants of the Oldsmobile make it home without further incident. Betty drops off Vickie and young Colby, then drives herself home and goes to bed. Unlike a lot of claims of this kind of thing, these witnesses reported no missing time. They made no claims about meeting little grey men. No men in black came to hassle them after the event. None of that. What they did experience was a lot more frightening and arguably a lot more convincing, certainly to me, than any of those kinds of tropes. If all the details are true, that is. That's a big caveat, but we'll come to that in a minute. Vickie and Betty claimed that starting that very night, and increasingly over the following days, the three of them all began to experience a range of unpleasant physical symptoms, seemingly as a direct result of their close encounter. To varying degrees in the hours and days and weeks after the incident, all three experienced eye irritation, lingering tiredness, nausea, diarrhea, and apparently sunburn on exposed areas of the skin. Contrary to some reports, it seems Colby and Vickie Landrum, in the immediate aftermath, experienced these symptoms only, and only mildly. Betty Cash, on the other hand, who had been exposed to a far greater degree, having fully alighted from the car and approached the object, experienced far greater symptoms in addition to the ones that affected Colby and Vickie. She reported blistering sunburn, facial swelling, difficulty walking, and hair loss. Jerome Clark, in his authoritative tome on the subject, the UFO Encyclopedia, The Phenomenon from the Beginning, notes that Cash was admitted to a hospital emergency room 5 days later, on January the 3rd, 1981. She spent 12 days in hospital, was released, and then later returned to hospital for a further 2 weeks.
Is this a matter of record then?
Yes, but again, we will come back to that. The devil is in the detail. Sometime after these events, MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, supposedly had a radiologist look over her medical notes from this time. This radiologist is quoted as saying, "We have strong evidence that these patients have suffered secondary damage due to ionizing radiation." Much later, I haven't been able to find the precise date, but it does seem to have been years later, Betty Cash would also develop breast cancer and undergo a double mastectomy, which she strongly maintained was due to her exposure to this object. But that's jumping way into the future. Back to 1981. Following the event, Cash and Landrum wrote to their senators, John Tower and Lloyd Benson. One thing led to another, and on the morning of 17th of August 1981, the three witnesses were invited to Bergstrom Air Force Base near Austin, Texas, for an interview with US Air Force Captains Terry Davis and John Camp, the base claims officer and the acting staff judge advocate, respectively. So these are the people who deal with, they're essentially lawyers. They deal with civil claims against the Air Force for when people have suffered a loss due to Air Force activity. The transcript of this interview is available online. I'll link to it in the show notes. It's very interesting. I recommend checking it out if you're so inclined. But long story short, the Air Force representatives are not really able to give much insight into what the object might have been, to whether they really were Air Force helicopters. It's really more of an interview of the witnesses than the other way around. You know, as I say, these are lawyers after all, rather than high clearance officials. But they promise to pass the information along to some departments that might be able to look a little further into it. They're very careful not to make any promises, but they do provide Ms. Cash and Ms. Landrum with the documents and the paperwork necessary to file a legal claim against the United States Air Force. So this ultimately became one of the few UFO encounters, hell, maybe the only UFO encounter, to eventuate in an actual civil court case. They sued the United States Air Force for $20 million, but were unfortunately, and maybe unsurprisingly, unsuccessful. The case was dismissed in 1986. The Air Force naturally claimed that they owned no large diamond-shaped aircraft, that they had no aircraft in the area at the time, that the helicopters weren't theirs, But the case is often held up as one of the most convincing UFO mysteries, with its multiple witnesses, including independent witnesses, supposedly with its wealth of physical evidence and effects on the witnesses. We'll come back to that in just a minute. As with any famous UFO case, there are a wide range of theories as to what actually happened that night. And these range from the mundane to the esoteric to the completely bonkers. Vickie Landrum herself, interesting to note, based on some statements in the Air Force interview transcript, did not seem to subscribe to the idea that there was anything otherworldly about the object necessarily. Once she's changed her mind about Disco Jesus anyway, she seemed to be very much of the mind that this was a man-made, she used that word, man-made machine that has exposed them to radiation poisoning. On the other hand, Stephen Greer, a retired traumatologist and founder of the Disclosure Project.
God.
You know this guy?
Stephen Greer.
Yeah.
Oh, I know him very well.
Yeah. You know what's coming. He claims to have been informed by sources that are secret and we have absolutely no way of verifying that the unknown vehicle was indeed of extraterrestrial origin, but was being flown by human pilots. So his story goes that the US military had seized a downed alien spacecraft, tried to reverse engineer it to get it working again, but had been unable to repair or refuel or understand the vehicle's power source. So these human engineers had installed their own miniature nuclear reactor, and what the occupants of the car witnessed that night was 4 human pilots struggling to pilot an alien vehicle with an insufficient malfunctioning power source, which is what then irradiated the witnesses. I mean, why they would choose to test this kind of technology on the edge of a populated area, as opposed to, say, the middle of the Arizona desert or out at sea somewhere, I don't know. And also, what sort of man-made reactor is this that's pumping out radiation into the outside environment? That seems like a really shitty reactor,
Yeah.
Reactors in submarines and ships and stuff, they're contained. They don't blast out huge doses of radiation into the environment. Maybe trace amounts.
In saying that, you're trying to hardwire it into an alien system that you don't really know how it works. So, I mean, I suppose.
Yeah, but unless they're ruptured or something, they don't put out fallout into the
radiated material.
Yeah. And if that was the case, then you'd be looking at really a pretty major incident, not just the occupants of the car, but the pilots of the vessel, the helicopter pilots who are escorting it for quite a long time. They're exposed to it for longer than the witnesses. They're all receiving potentially lethal doses, not to mention, fallout in the environment, which, it has to be said, was never detected. As outlandish as Greer's explanation is, and as much as some of the details don't quite seem to make sense, given some of the things that have come out more recently and from very official sources about tic-tac UAPs and mystery drones and whatnot, which is another topic we don't have time here to launch into, I still don't really think it's necessarily completely beyond the realms of reason to entertain the idea of the US military or some other actor, earthly or otherwise, being in possession of propulsion systems that don't resemble anything we would normally recognise. I think there is something genuinely believable about the story in general. I'm not talking about Greer's explanation here.
The description of the craft really sounds believable to me.
Oh yeah.
It's almost like the almost kind of flames coming out the bottom of it. It doesn't
sound sci-fi.
It doesn't sound science fiction. Yeah. It's
also interesting that this event occurred just a few days after an even more famous UFO case with a military connection, the Rendlesham Forest Incident.
Yeah, I was nearly going to do that topic, and then I remembered that I think you had mentioned wanting to do it at some point. So.
Yeah, well, it would be nice to do it. It has some startling similarities to this case, actually, which could almost be the same. Maybe we'll cover that one next Christmas, right? However, for all the very compelling aspects, for all the undoubted passion and sincerity of the witnesses, there are a few very big questions hanging around this story which just make it all a little bit slippery and hard to really unreservedly get behind. It would be remiss of me not to deal with those. So,
Yeah.
in terms of the non-medical evidence, there's been a lot in the media and a lot of lines of print dedicated to the amount of physical evidence in this case, of treetops scorched, of circular burn marks to the surface of the road, of this celebrated handprint on the dashboard of Betty's Oldsmobile when she reached over and hit the dashboard and left her own handprint because it was so hot it softened the vinyl. A lot of these details are highlighted by John F. Schuessler, a MUFON director and principal investigator of the Cash-Landrum case. He literally wrote the book on the Cash-Landrum case. But I haven't been able to find a single photograph of any of this. According to an Unsolved Mysteries that dealt with this case, there is supposedly a witness, one Amy Mosley, who says workers in unmarked vans showed up some days after the event, dug up the damaged asphalt, and resurfaced the road. But the lack of any photographs of any of this, when people like Schuessler are saying they have physically visited the site and seen this, is kind of damning. And this is something that researchers who put far more time into this than I have, and who have far more resources at their disposal than I have also commented on. So it's not just me. Betty Cash mentions photographs of the burnt branches in the Bergstrom Air Force Base interview in the transcript, but there don't seem to be any out there as far as I can tell. So that leaves us with eyewitness descriptions, including the somewhat corroborating eyewitness descriptions of third parties that we mentioned, which, yes, they are a form of evidence in themselves. But, it's the kind of evidence all UFO claims have, and we usually wouldn't consider that, enough to say that this definitely happened, not on its own. It might pique our interest, but it's not the extraordinary evidence that the extraordinary claims demand, if you want to take the Carl Sagan approach. But we also have the medical evidence, the health effects on the witnesses, and this is interesting because if they truly were suffering from radiation sickness, there's very few ways for an ordinary civilian to be exposed to a high dose of ionizing radiation while looking for a bingo game, Yeah. At the very least, I think that would prove beyond reasonable doubt that something out with mundane suburban normality happened to the occupants of the car that night, if it could be shown that they were genuinely suffering from radiation sickness. But can that be shown? Well, unfortunately, no. In fact, a close inspection points away from radiation sickness as the cause of their health troubles. A number of investigators, from ufologist Brad Sparks to skeptic Dr. Gary Posner to Aerial Phenomena Research Organisation advisor and erstwhile consultant oncologist Dr. Richard Niemco, have all pointed out that although there are some similarities between the symptoms described and radiation sickness, symptoms like hair falling out, abdominal pain, diarrhea, skin blistering within a few hours.
Superhuman strength.
Yeah. Superhuman strength aside, these are not indicative of mild radiation poisoning. They would very likely, in the amount that they are claimed to have occurred and altogether, they would very likely indicate a fatal dose. The fact is, all the passengers survived for many years after the supposed exposure, and Colby, now in his 40s, is still alive and well, which seems then to preclude ionizing radiation as the cause of their troubles. So then one question needs to be asked, really. What was the witnesses' health like before the encounter? What was their underlying health like? Vickie and Colby Landrum symptoms were less intense, so let's set them aside just for a moment. We'll come back to them. Let's take a closer look at Betty Cash's health. As I've said, one of the main investigators of this case, the man most responsible for publicising the case, was John Schuessler of MUFON. Schuessler was made privy to Betty Cash's medical records, and in his book and other writings on the subject, he made much of her hair loss, her skin burns, her hospital stays in the wake of the event. But although he has published some very selective parts of these records, Schuessler has been notoriously cagey about releasing more information or sharing these records with other investigators. Now, on the one hand, of course, there is the matter of Miss Cash's privacy to consider, right? She's been through, she's dead now, unfortunately, but she's been through some terrible health issues. There's no doubt in my mind about that. And to compound that by having her private medical records scrutinised and pored over by every UFO weirdo and professional debunker out there, I get it, that would be unfair. I totally get that. She didn't ask to be put in that situation. But this caginess extended also to more official bodies, which could have helped the witnesses financially and could have helped prove Schuessler's journalistic case about the encounter if the totality of the medical records indeed supported the claims as Schuessler seems to have always maintained. For example, the Texas Department of Health's Bureau of Radiation Control showed a genuine interest in the case following the Bergstrom Air Force Base interview. Schuessler had close contact with this department initially. They appeared to be genuinely concerned about the claims. You know, here you have a powerful state agency, completely independent of the Air Force, and any cover-ups or conflicts of interest that the military might have in exposing this, and with the resources and the political oomph to maybe do something about it. This is a gift, right? They offered to investigate this. That's excellent news, right? But to kick off the investigation, the department asked for approval for their doctors to examine the victim's medical records. At which point, according to UFO researcher Kirk Collins and the Texas Department of Health's own report, Schuessler abruptly ended contact with the department. These facts have led several researchers to question whether Schuessler was cherry-picking information from the medical records, taking only the parts that supported the theory that this was radiation poisoning, taking those out of context and withholding the parts that might have contradicted that possibility. It also bears mentioning that criticism of Schuessler's handling of the case and his apparent inconsistencies don't end there. For example, he states in his book, The Cash-Landrum UFO Incident, although neither Vickie or Betty had been back to the site since the incident, they both were able to take us to nearly the exact same location. The separate site visits verify the location of the incident for us, so he says he was able to be taken to the precise location. In multiple TV interviews and magazine articles, he is quoted as saying that the victims took him to the site and he was able to visually identify the burned road surface, therefore identifying the precise spot, right? However, during his brief contact with the Texas Department of Health, they asked him if he had pinpointed the exact location and, quote, Mr. Schuessler stated that due to the late hour and the lady's emotional state, they could only state they believed they saw the object on the straight portion of FR 1485 between a beer joint and some kind of highway warning sign. So, unless the Department of Health is badly misquoting him, or, is part of some conspiracy to discredit him maybe, there's no way of reconciling those two statements. They're contradictory. He's either been to the specific site and seen the burn marks on the ground and been taken there by the witnesses, or the witnesses don't know precisely where it is and can only say it's on this 5-mile section of road. They can't both be true. There's a lot of contradictory and slippery, inconsistent evidence like that in this case. In terms of Betty Cash's medical records, is there something in there that Schuessler was worried would discredit the case? For example, Dr. Gary Posner and skeptical writer Robert Schaefer hypothesized that photographs of localized circular burns on Betty's hands and forearm, which could not have been caused by an indiscriminately radiating radiation source because they're localized spots, were likely made by covering up the arm with a garment with circular cutouts and then exposing it to the sun, either to add weight to their case or, to sort of boost the evidence by adding a little bit of your own, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Or as a manifestation of Munchausen syndrome. Munchausen syndrome is a psychiatric condition that drives people to feign disease. Is the phrase Munchausen syndrome somewhere in those redacted medical notes, and that's why Schuessler is so reluctant to release them?
Ah, yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. But it is important to stress at this point that until there is solid evidence for that, that is just as much conjecture as any of the more outlandish theories in the case. I don't personally believe, certainly not wholeheartedly, that Betty had Munchausen syndrome, but it is necessary to mention that as one of the theories here. One interesting detail that did manage to make it into the published medical information in Schuessler's book, it's highlighted by Brian Dunning in his episode on the case, is that Cash's sunburn, headaches and other symptoms cleared up quickly during her hospital stay, which again, unlikely to be the case if ionizing radiation had shredded her DNA. And the one major symptom that remained was some patchy hair loss on her head. This hair loss, though, is noted by the doctors as being caused by alopecia areata, which was confirmed by doctors who performed a biopsy on her hair follicles. Alopecia areata is completely different from the hair loss experienced by those exposed to radiation. It's a genetic autoimmune disease where the immune system attacks the hair follicles. It's a completely different thing. So here we have at least one instance of detailed medical information contradicting the established version of the story with the radiation poisoning. At Chernobyl, the victims who were irradiated to the point of having sunburn-like skin peeling and blisters and reddening, like the witnesses here. In the case of Chernobyl, these effects initially healed, and then, this is nasty, but 2 months later, the dermal vascular systems of those patients collapsed, basically causing most of their skin to slough off after it seemed that they'd healed.
God.
And obviously nothing like that happened here. Thank God.
Radiation poisoning just seems to be one of the most horrendous things.
It's a bad time, Michael. It's a bad time.
Just imagine you wearing a t-shirt that just says Chernobyl, a bad time.
2 out of 10. So I think we can safely exclude the possibility that these witnesses were subjected to a high dose of ionizing radiation. It just doesn't really hold up to scrutiny.
She clearly wasn't well, though. I mean, that's that.
No, she wasn't. And we can't exclude the possibility, I think maybe even the likelihood, that they were exposed to a high dose of ultraviolet radiation. I'll come back to that in a minute. But what of the milder symptoms experienced by Vickie and Colby Landrum? Surely the chances of all three of these people coming down with similar symptoms completely independently, albeit with different severities, is very, very unlikely unless their shared experience was also the shared cause of their problems. Well, here's what I think could have happened. This is the scenario as I see it. I think they genuinely saw something. I think they had a genuine experience that they could not easily explain. Something that terrified them. Something that caused them to fear for their lives. What was it? Well, that's the $64,000 question. Whether it was something unearthly, whether it was something of human, military or industrial origin, or maybe some combination of the two, who knows? I would lean towards this being a man-made object, you know me, Michael, but I can't say for sure. What's important is most early symptoms of severe radiation sickness are hard to distinguish from the symptoms of shock. If Colby and Vickie had diarrhea and abdominal cramps and tiredness and headaches and nausea and even...
They just shit themselves, basically.
Well, yes, exactly.
Quite literally.
Yeah. Even losing a few hairs over the days following almost being fried to death on a lonely back road by Disco Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, certainly stress can make your hair fall out, and there are stories as well about people, their hair turning grey. I don't know how true that is, but absolutely with stress, your hair can fall out.
Definitely. All those things happening to people who've just experienced something like that, I'm not in the least surprised by that. And in fact, the Air Force interview transcript shows that the witnesses didn't immediately attribute their symptoms to radiation from the object. By the time they give the interview, they have ascribed it to that, and now they're seeking compensation. But it was only after Betty was admitted to hospital a few days later, and then had been in there for a while, that they started talking about it and came to this conclusion. Could it be that Betty Cash had a predisposition to this underlying autoimmune disorder, and it just so happened to manifest itself after this event? Or, as you say, the stress of the event helped it to manifest?
Yeah.
Because according to the Mayo Clinic, severe stress may well be one factor in the onset of alopecia areata. So then imagine you're Vickie Landrum, right? You've had this experience. You and your grandson have had some apparent symptoms, not maybe necessarily understanding that that was likely shock. And your friend has been hospitalized with issues you believe are caused by the actions of the US Air Force. This is under the US healthcare system, so you've all suffered medical expenses. Your friend has ongoing issues. For all you know, your lifespan has been shortened by it. You feel you're entitled to compensation for all this, and quite rightly so if your assumptions are correct. Do you think you might be tempted to perhaps slightly overemphasize your very real symptoms in support of your case and in support of your friend? I think you might. In the same way, I mean, it's a far lesser situation, don't get me wrong, but if I'm genuinely unwell and I need to call in sick to work, I might almost unconsciously exaggerate my sore throat on the phone to my boss, you know?
Yeah, because you're... Yeah.
It's not dishonest as such, but you're just trying to make your case.
You don't want people to think that you're faking it.
Yeah.
And then inadvertently make people think that you're faking it by going,
exactly.
"Hello, I can't make it to work today."
Fired when he comes in on Monday. So I think there might be an element of all of that here. That's just my opinion, but having read the transcripts in the case and read some of the research of others, that explanation seems to tick more of the boxes than any other. And it doesn't have any of the logical issues the radiation poisoning theory does. The one thing it doesn't satisfactorily explain is the apparent sunburn they all experienced. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to. This is Texas. Even in winter, there's enough UV flying around on a bright day to give you a nasty sunburn if you're not careful. According to Weather Underground, that afternoon had been sunny with cloudy spells and a temperature reaching 68 Fahrenheit or about 20 degrees Celsius. In Glasgow, that would be well and truly taps-aff weather.
Yeah.
As many a Scot can tell you, you can easily get sunburn on a 20-degree sunny day.
We go insane when there's nice weather.
Yeah. Another interesting thing about I didn't go looking for this. I went looking to see what the weather was like that day. And you can look at historical weather records for certain days. No precipitation that day in Houston. It doesn't give... I mean, this is about 20 or 30 miles from Houston itself. It doesn't give precise weather for the precise area. It gives it sort of more generally for the Houston area. So there might have been rain in this area and not in Houston, just a few miles up the road. But it does say there was no precipitation that day, the day before, or the day before that. Which is interesting because one of the things Betty Cash says is that she doesn't want to drive on the side of the road because it's wet, because it's been raining. So that's another potential small inconsistency, but I won't lean too heavily on that because the resolution of the weather site is not too great. But these were not silly peely-wally Scots going mad sunbathing on the first warm day of spring. These people are Texans. I think we can assume they didn't just accidentally fail to notice a horrendous case of sunburn that day. Which leaves the possibility that this unknown object, which almost certainly wasn't a strong source of X-rays, gamma rays, that kind of high-energy ionizing radiation, as some would have us believe, may have been a strong source of lower-energy ultraviolet radiation. Ultraviolet radiation is the component of sunlight that causes sunburn. It's essentially a colour of light that lies beyond the blue end of the visual spectrum. It's invisible to the naked eye. It's higher energy than visible light. It can cause cell damage, which we see the effects of in sunburn, cell aging, some types of skin cancers. But all but the most extreme upper UV is not considered ionizing radiation, which is what causes acute radiation syndrome and cutaneous radiation syndrome. There are sources other than sunlight which can produce high amounts of UV radiation. Sun lamps, tanning tubes, oxyacetylene and oxyhydrogen flames, electric arcs. Welders wear protective equipment for this exact reason. Their exposed skin can be badly sunburned by the UV light produced by the welding torch at like 3000 degrees Celsius. Which makes me wonder about the flame that they saw at the bottom of the object. Could this have been some high temperature chemical or physical reaction producing UV light? It's unlikely that like a welder flame 100 feet away would do any damage, but something similar but bigger and more powerful. Chinook helicopters are typically used as lifters, right? So these people could have witnessed one of them actually tethered to and hauling some kind of acetylene burning machinery or some device producing a powerful electric arc. I mean, it would seem wildly dangerous, not to mention negligent, to transport something like that in an active state, but then again, maybe that explains why no organisation ever owned up to being responsible for it. Or, alternatively, this could have genuinely been some exotic, perhaps even unearthly technology that they witnessed. Perhaps something that burns so hot it produces light far into the UV spectrum. Who are we to say, I suppose? So yeah, it's a compelling case, but it's also quite a frustrating one. When you first look at it, it seems like there's this abundance of physical evidence pointing in one direction. Then you peel back a couple of layers and that evidence just sort of melts away, or it's undermined by some other aspect. I think it's possible that certain researchers with certain agendas might have tried to hack and cherry pick the evidence early on to fit a particular narrative, and thereby muddied the waters to the point where the truth is hard to unpick now 40 years later. If that hadn't happened at the start, we might have a lot more answers now, possibly. One thing I'm fairly certain of is that Betty Cash, Vickie Landrum and Colby Landrum experienced something that night. Something that terrified them, something that might well have had some negative effects on their health. It might have been mundane, it might not have been mundane, but something happened that night, Michael. And we don't know what it was. Truly a horrendous but Christmas mystery. Unfortunately, Betty Cash died 18 years later, to the day after the event.
Really? Wow.
Just shy of her 70th birthday. Not young exactly, but certainly younger than one would hope to live to. She wasn't in great health for some of those years. It was never proven that her poor health and death really had anything to do with the incident, although Schuessler maintained that he believed it was connected. The health problems she suffered, breast cancer, etc., don't really drastically differ from common causes of death, really. Vickie Landrum died in September 1997 at the age of 83, which is, a fair age to live to. One of the other pieces of evidence that Schuessler lent on is that after the event, Vickie Landrum developed cataracts, which he connected to the event. But again,
that's really common.
Yeah. Colby Landrum, though, is still alive and well, and he has never had any real answers for what he experienced, unfortunately. He's still looking for the truth. So yeah, Cash-Landrum case. Michael, what's your thoughts?
There's so many of these strange encounters that we're going to be in business for a long time, Martin. I think what compels me the most, it's got everything, doesn't it? A lonely road, out by the woods, strange lights from the sky. Yeah. It's got the US government.
If you look at the road on Google Maps, it looks like classic X-Files road surrounded by pines and tall trees.
Yeah.
It's that to a T. It's beautiful.
Yeah. There's a couple of things. I think the most compelling thing about it is the description of the craft, if you can call it that. Like, whatever that was, there's a very tangible, real-world feel to the descriptions that they gave.
Yeah.
Often UFOs are described in an almost kind of surreal or hyper-technological sort of way rather than something that's grounded in what we could make.
Yeah.
Not you and me. I'm sure we give it a damn good try, but humanity. I think that's really interesting. I do think... What year was this again?
1980.
1980. I mean, it was funny when you were talking about the description of the craft being like a diamond with the bottom cut off.
Yeah.
It reminded me of... Don't know if I'm visualising it wrong, but it just reminded me of a Star Destroyer. They've got like the sort of flames, but they're coming out at the back.
Yeah.
And it's 1980, peak Star Wars, Empire Strikes Back. But anyway, I mean, I think...
This is more of a kind of upright thing, almost like a spinning top, but diamond-shaped.
Right.
But with a very small area at the very top and bottom that was flattened off.
And the other thing I thought was a little bit strange was that when they went to the cemetery and they looked out and they saw the helicopters and they say that they could read the lettering on the...
This is an interesting point I didn't really dwell on, and I haven't been able to completely confirm this, but apparently one inconsistency or two inconsistencies is that they said that they saw United States Air Force written out longhand on the side of these Chinooks, right? At that time, and I believe still to this day, it does say United States Air Force on Air Force helicopters, but in very, very, very small text. The larger text will simply be USAF.
Yeah.
So the fact they maintained they saw United States Air Force written out longhand on the side doesn't actually fit, although that could just be memory, you know how memory works.
Yeah. But it also seemed unusual to me that they could see that with the naked eye.
Yeah, that's the other thing. Although one did fly directly overhead, but again, it surprised them and then flew back over the trees. How much of a good look did they get? How reliable is the memory that's at work here? It is interesting that lots of people saw Chinook helicopters around there,
Yeah.
which is unusual. The other thing, though, I was going to say is that, and I'm not sure I believe it, but if it is true, it's also quite damning. Some sources have said that in 1980, the United States Air Force, specifically, didn't actually own any Chinooks. So that would be a bit of a bummer if that turned out to be the case.
But then you can also be talking about black projects and things like that.
Yeah.
Things that are off the books. And but you know the thing that really struck me? It was one of the first things that jumped into my mind at the beginning of the account. We've talked about this before, though we've yet to do an episode on it. I think we'll probably have to fight each other to see who gets to do it. But the Tic Tac UFO that's really famous at the moment. When Commander David Fravor, he was one of the pilots that engaged with it, and he was on the Joe Rogan podcast. He mentioned he used to kind of make fun of UFOs, and he told a story. He said sometimes what we would do is we would be taking our jets out at night across kind of more remote locations, and you know, these jets can hover and they can go into like a silent mode where all the lights are off and everything, and they would deliberately play jokes on people that were out camping. What they would do is they would go into this, I'm sure people who know more about this are cringing as I try to describe this, but they would go into this kind of flying mode where
silent running or whatever.
Yeah.
It was like a Harrier or something he was in, yeah.
I don't know, but he said that they would switch off all the lights and literally be over, and then they could flip on their thrusters and all these lights just light up the whole area and then shoot off.
Yeah.
And he says they did that on more than one occasion just for a laugh. And they knew that stories would come back if somebody saying, we just saw a UFO. And part of that, I don't know, kind of, it sometimes makes me think, it's like how many of these instances are people just kind of bored and they're having a laugh?
Yeah.
But anyway, no, it's a fascinating case.
Could this be a prank like that where some bored helicopter pilots that for whatever reason they're in the area, they've got like some big old tank or something lying around the airfield and they're like, tell you what, throw a burning oxyacetylene tank in the bottom of that, we'll take it off and fly it around, make people think it's a UFO. Yeah. And then, oh shit, we've actually burned some people, so hush hush. Yeah. I doubt it, but it's a possibility. It's a possibility.
I mean, a lot of the inconsistencies that you talked about later on, especially the stuff to do with radiation poisoning, I wouldn't necessarily see that as completely damning. It's like you say, you believe they saw something, and to me it sounds as if they probably did. But then
I think the problems with attribution, I think some of the ufologists have come in and really muddied the waters because they have leapt to the conclusion of radiation poisoning. Because if they could prove that, then it would be a slam dunk for them.
Yeah.
And they've gone in with this preconceived idea and they have muddied the waters here.
And then the flip side of that as well, if you want to get truly speculative, is if this was some sort of either alien technology that human beings were trying to get their heads around, or if it was an alien craft piloted by non-humans. If it was that sort of technology, to be really speculative, there could be something about that technology that does something to the human body or to biology that we wouldn't even totally understand. At the turn of the 20th century, I can't remember who it was, but there was a famous quote by someone that was about, like, we pretty much know everything. And as far as I can see with physics, especially, there are these periods where they think they understand everything, and then they find out that there are huge gaps in the theories, or they discover something completely new that means that they have to come up.
But I also worry about us talking like that is that we're just purely talking out of the Dunning-Kruger effect hole. You and I probably know so little about physics that we're just like, yeah, they probably just don't know. And there's
I know what you mean, but like I genuinely think you can apply that to any area of inquiry. I mean, yeah, of course, I'm not a physicist. I have great interest in it.
Yeah.
But I'm not a physicist. So yeah, absolutely. I'm really, really interested. I suppose it is in kind of fringe physics and things like that, but like I am very interested in some topics that would make me believe that from a philosophical perspective about science in general, and that theories are descriptions of things, and theories are not the same as the things that they describe. And so therefore there's always a gap, and there always will be a gap, between what the theory states and what reality actually is.
I don't know if there's always a gap. I think some things are absolute.
Do you know?
I think some things are probably absolute.
This is something that I'd like to do an episode on, but it would maybe take Talking to Don in a different direction. There's a guy called Donald Hoffman. He has some really interesting theories and quite compelling, I think. I think his argument's quite compelling about how the way our brains have developed, evolution has not selected for accuracy. And in fact, that he's into like the sort of science of perception. And his idea is that what we perceive the world to be is just an artifact of the architecture of our brains, and that it's not just that we only see a sliver of reality, but even the tiny piece of reality that we perceive is completely different. He's got this idea of like a user interface. What we see is like the icons on a desktop. It's not actually...
So this is like the Immanuel Kant, the thing in itself concept.
Yeah, he deals with intrinsic values and things like that, but he really... he makes a really plausible argument for why, from an evolutionary perspective, we have evolved to experience reality in a certain way.
That's why things like optical illusions work, because they're, you know...
My only point is that I'm not saying that theories within physics are wrong. I'm just saying that I would always have doubt about them to a degree. And that doubt might only be 5% doubt, 95% certainty, but there's always going to be a level of doubt about whether those theories are correct. If there's technologies in the future that aliens have, or that we would have, 1,000 or 1,000,000 years in the future, I'm sure it would be indistinguishable from magic.
Oh, yeah, yeah. You heard it here first, folks. We started with a light in the sky, and now we've arrived at a new kind of physics altogether.
Good luck editing that.
Thanks, Michael.
Just fucking delete the last 10 minutes.
Yeah, everyone, thank you so much for listening. I hope you've all had a good Christmas and have a good New Year, and I hope you have a good 2021, and we will be back hopefully in January at some point, fingers crossed, with a new episode. Mike, is there anything you want to say to our lovely listeners before we go?
Something I would like to say to you, Martin. So we started Talking Till Dawn a year ago in October, I believe, or was it the end of
a year and 3 months roughly.
Round about then. So we never really did, not that we had a big party or anything like that, but I just wanted to say that doing this show has been one of the most rewarding things that I've ever been involved in.
Likewise.
And I'd just like to thank you, Martin, for everything that you do. And it's just always been so much fun to have an excuse to sit with my mate and talk about these topics. And for all the listeners who have been there with us, it's been a fantastic experience. So here's to many more.
You're part of the discussion as well. Silent part of the discussion. And that's what's so good about it.
Are you talking about the way that sounded as if you're talking about me?
No, I was talking to listeners.
It sounded like you're talking about me, and you are a silent piece of the Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year, everybody. Owen, bye.
Bye.